Dr. Marie Fang is joining me today to talk about money, specifically our audience's questions about money. She initially asked me to come onto her channel, Private Practice Skills, but there was so much to talk about that we decided to divvy up this conversation into two parts. This part on my channel, we'll be talking about emotions, financial scarcity, and practical ways to find financial help. And over on her channel, I'll be answering some questions that therapists had specifically related to money. So this episode is a little bit different in that Marie is going to be acting as more of the interviewer and I'll be answering questions. We'll be talking about the data that Marie compiled. Marie really put on her researcher hat. We put out these questions to our respective audiences and Marie compiled all of the data and we dig into the responses that we got, and then I also share some answers to those questions. If you don't know Marie, in addition to being the host of Private Practice Skills, she is also a mother, a wife, an animal lover, and also loves a little DIY project, which makes perfect sense because, as I shared, her YouTube channel is the side hustle that she started after starting her own private practice. So it's pretty impressive if you ask me. Again, if you're a therapist in private practice, you're definitely going to want to check out Marie's corresponding video that I will link here for you. We will start out with a few yes/no questions from our audience and then get into some questions around financial scarcity, emotions and money, and some tactical strategies for how to find appropriate help when you're struggling financially.
Well, let's dive into it. I'm super glad that you're here. And I think you're talking about such important things related to financial and emotional health around finances. So I think some of the data we got is really interesting from our various audiences. So the first question was, what were you taught about money and emotions growing up? And we both sent these questions to each of our audiences. And Lindsay, as I was putting this together, I noticed that each of our audiences had just very different answers. Were you taught about money and emotions growing up? My audience, 17% said yes and 82% said no.
Yeah, and for my audience, 54% said yes and 45% said no. So very different, right?
What even happened?
So, I mean, I have a hypothesis.
Because I don't. So I don't hear it.
But I have a hypothesis that the audience who is following me is already a little bit more tuned into the emotional side of money because they're opting in to see content from a person whose brand is called Mind Money Balance. Whereas Marie's audience is primarily therapists. Now, it's not to say my audience doesn't include therapists, but I think more of my audience is already interested in the emotional side of money. So I think there is a little bit of opting into more content because you may be already primed to talk about emotions and money. That's my hypothesis.
That makes sense. If they're subscribed to you, they're already at least a little bit savvy and tuned in. I'm not really sure what other hypothesis would explain things. And even with that said, Lindsay, I mean, your audience is still pretty close to 50-50. And my audience is like almost the whole audience who responded just weren't taught about money and emotions growing up. I mean, I'm curious, like, does that surprise you?
No, it does not surprise me. I think my audience is a little atypical. I think if we were to take your audience, I think that is a more representative slice of the way in which most people talk about emotions and money. In my financial therapy work, plenty of people have stories about the way their parents or caregivers talked about money itself, but very rarely did they talk about the way that money might make you feel or the way that your feelings might impact a purchasing or saving decision. I think most of us have some like peripheral stories of like, oh yeah, I remember being in the grocery store line with my parent and wanting to get something from the candy aisle and my parent telling me no. Like, we have some of those memories, but we don't necessarily have the memory of our parents saying, yeah, it feels like you want a candy bar right now, and that might be because you're craving a little bit of excitement. Like, unless we had some highly emotionally attuned parents, I know you all are out there, but I think that's probably pretty rare.
Yeah, I'm even thinking, I mean, I got my two little kids and I am the parent with the kid wanting the candy bar at the store, like every time. So I already just learned a tip from you, like, okay, because I usually do like, oh, we already have the snack at home, but like the emotional piece being key piece. I mean, I wasn't taught about money and emotions growing up, so I need to learn all your tips as well.
I've shared before, Marie, that my my mom was really good about talking to me about money, but even the emotional side that was lacking. And it's, again, no judgment on her at all. It's really hard to have that conversation because so few of us have an understanding of like, oh, actually, how do I feel about money? You know?
What a question. How do I feel as an adult and then to try to teach that to your kid? There's no
Right.
way. We're already kind of poking at some good stuff. Okay. So the next question that we asked, which is a little bit more broad, is did your parents or caregivers talk to you about money? We had some discrepancy again in our responses.
Yeah, and this is where my hypothesis goes out the window.
Yeah. So my audience was pretty close to a 50-50 split. The question, did your parents or caregivers talk to you about money? Yes, from my audience was 55%, and then no was 45%. So it sounds like about half of them had their caregiver talk to them about money, but just not the emotions part of money. Lindsay, I wonder what happened with your data.
I don't know what happened with my data. This is where, like, if we were doing rigorous data, we would probably come through this and be like, was there any discrepancy in how we collected the data? But you and I, Marie, use the exact same language. So I'm at a bit of a loss. For my audience, when they responded to the question, did your parents or caregivers talk to you about money? 90% of them said, nope, no one talked to me about money. Even though, if you remember, it was like a 50-50 split in the last question that they talked about the emotional side of money. So that one's curious because only 10% said, yeah, my parents or caregivers talk to me about money in general. So if you have a hypothesis, great. If not, I'm with you.
I mean, the one thing that's different between this question and the other question is we identified parents or caregivers. So that's wondering too, if like, is it that people who learned about money emotions learned about that from somewhere else?
Yeah.
But where else would we learn about it as a young person?
I think you're touching on something though, Marie, which is, yes, we learn from our parents and caregivers, but also the research shows that by the time we're about 8 years old, we more or less have decided what we think about money. And it's just not our parents or caregivers talking to us about anything. It is also our peers. It is also our community. It's also our places of spiritual fulfillment. There are many different ways that we're getting messages about money. And depending on what type of school you went to, what type of neighborhood you lived in, what type of spiritual service you attended, maybe you got some different information. But then when it comes to parents or caregivers, maybe it was a little bit more hush hush in my audience and a little bit more open in your audience.
And as you said, this isn't a like IRB approved.
Yeah, don't come for us, IRB.
But it's still such valuable data. And we had over 100 people respond between the two of us, and about half were from yours and half were from mine. So I think this is still really valuable data, but it is kind of like leave a comment below if you have a theory on what happened here. But super interesting. And still, all of that said, across the board, it's not like everyone's saying, yep, my parents, my caregivers talk to me about money, which is just like so hard for me to wrap my head around, like not talking to my children about money at all. And like I have a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, and we're already talking about with 3-year-old a little bit, so it's just wild to imagine just having that skipped over completely. Like, how are you supposed to know anything money related? Because then they don't teach it in school. So here we are. This is why you need to be here. You need to help us. The next category that came up was around scarcity mindset. Maybe it might be worth kind of naming, like, what is scarcity mindset? And if that's something that people are dealing with, how can they overcome that?
So the way that I think of scarcity mindset when it comes to our finances is this idea that money is a finite resource and we only have the capacity to earn so much. So when we talk about a scarcity mindset or a limited mindset around our personal finances, it's often this idea that I will only be able to make X dollars, or if I spend X dollars, then I'm going to somehow turn a switch and spend all of my money. So it can look like two things. It can look like struggling to imagine that you can earn more than this kind of ceiling that you've implemented on yourself. And it can also look like being so fearful of spending money that you don't actually take the next steps that are necessary to help you financially speaking. So if we use private practice as an example, I had a bit of anxiety when I started my private practice. And when it comes to billing, I didn't want to pay the $40 a month to do the billing through my electronic health record. So I manually would do my own billing, which I think about. It took me 2 to 4 hours a week, Marie, to do that. And so I think about the amount of time, not to mention the amount of money that I wasted doing my own billing because of this fear of I can't afford to spend $40 when if I zoomed out, the amount of time that I spent on that billing, I could have either been seeing clients and generating money, or I could have just had 2 to 4 hours a week to do
Yeah,
other things with my life. So that's a
makes
way
no
that
sense.
scarcity mindset can kind of show up. Yeah.
That is such a good example, and I mean, we're chuckling about it, but I think, like, I've had so many of those kinds of moments where it's like, "Oh, it's so expensive," and then it's like, "I'm gonna do it myself," and then you get so stuck in it, and it's like, "Wait, is this really worth my time? Maybe I can pay for it, or if I can exchange those hours for something, I'm gonna make more than the 40 bucks," but
Right.
it's hard to get out of that, and
That's where compassion comes in. Practicing some compassion around the spending piece. Is it really true that I can't afford this $40 expense? Where might
Mhm.
I have learned some of these fears around spending money? How did this scarcity mindset probably act as a protective factor for my parents, particularly if they are immigrants, were refugees, or grew up in a financially precarious situation? It makes sense that holding on tightly to money would help to keep them safe. So then you get to lovingly ask yourself, how true is it that I need to hold on tightly to money to keep myself safe versus that story helped them doesn't need to be the story that I carry?
Yeah. Yeah, I love how you tie it to there's always a compassionate story when we're stuck in a mindset or a choice that isn't maybe best serving us to say, well, that at some point has seemed to serve me or someone well. And so can I know that story and care for it? And also now it may not be serving me anymore. We can also kindly pivot. And that is such an important piece because I think it is
Yes.
so easy to get stuck in whatever negative self-perceptions that we can have around these things.
Mm.
Well, the question that we asked folks was getting people to directly ask you questions. And I think it'd be lovely to get into this and lots of categories of answers. There's no way we're going to get to all of the questions. But the question we put out there is if you could ask Lindsay anything about emotions and money, what would it be? So you're definitely in the hot seat now. And kind of your audience and my audience ask different kinds of questions generally. I'll say the biggest two categories that came from my audience was how to be less emotional about money, which I mean, we've kind of touched on. The other category that came up a lot was just direct money advice around taxes, investing, spending, student loan. What's the best way to pay off my student loans quickly? It's things that just get overwhelming. Like, help me with these things, please, Lindsay. And I don't know if it feels like there's kind of broad sweeping tips for this category of like how to be less emotional about money in general, how to be less anxious about money, kind of action steps towards that type of category of concern.
Yeah, I love this question. And I also think, particularly since we polled a lot of therapists, it's worth reminding them that we don't get to take our emotions and throw them away. We actually have to work with our emotions. Our emotions have a lot to teach us. When I see a question like this, how do I be less emotional about money? I'm actually really hearing and imagining that what they're trying to ask is something like, how do I be less reactive in my relationship with money? Or how can I feel less anxious in my relationship with money? Typically, I'm not telling my clients, just take your emotions and put them over here when you deal with money. That's not the way that it works. And what research shows is that between 80 and 90% of our financial decisions are driven by emotions. So to pretend that we can just turn off our emotions for 80 to 90% of our financial decisions just actually doesn't make sense. I actually love to invite people to think about what are the emotions that they're experiencing when they're engaging in different financial situations. So quite literally, the next time you get a paycheck, notice the emotion that comes up. The next time you pay a bill at dinner, notice what emotion comes up. The next time a friend Venmo requests you, notice what emotion comes up. And what we'll start to notice, much like what we tell our clients, is there will start to be patterns. Ooh, maybe I feel a little bit anxious about spending money, but I feel pretty calm when money's coming in. Or maybe I feel really avoidant around the technical things like budgeting and taxes, but I feel okay with the day-to-day things like buying groceries. So starting to notice what are the emotions that are going on and what are the emotions that are actually pretty uncomfortable for me, and how can I, again, lovingly, compassionately dial them down. So maybe we go from anxieties an 8 out of 10 on the anxiety scale. What can we do to get it to like a 5 or a 6? What can we do so that we still notice the anxiety, but we're able to take action? So rather than say, separate my emotions from how I look at money entirely, start to notice them, start to lovingly dial down the ones that are uncomfortable, and start to see what you can do to feel more neutral or less anxious or less reactive when it comes to engaging with money.
I love that, and as you're sharing that, on the one hand, I'm feeling like this is so revolutionary, Lindsay, like, we need more of this, and on the other hand, I'm thinking, this feels like all of our therapy tools being applied to our emotions around money. It's like, yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense, that's what
Yeah.
we're taught.
Yeah.
But how funny that it's, at least as it hits me, as you're sharing, thinking,
Mhm.
"Oh, those connections, no one," I shouldn't say no one, here you are, but, for me, no one is drawing those connections for me, like, yeah, your emotions around money are just like your emotions around anything else, and they're welcome, and they tell you something, and let's look for patterns, and let's address them with love and care. But it is revolutionary, like, who is actually talking about this? So, that's a really good tip. This other category of money advice, I mean, there's some specific questions in here, and so I wonder if it's actually
Mhm.
most helpful to kind of send it over to you, like, if there's a question you see in this sort of money advice around taxes, investing, student loans, all that, that kind of feel like you got some tips that you'd like to share.
There are a lot of specific questions, and I'm a financial therapist. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not a certified professional accountant. I'm not a tax lawyer or an employee lawyer. So, what I would say for all of these technical how to questions is do a little bit of your own research. And what I mean by that is literally turning to Google, turning to YouTube. I know a lot of people are like, why are you telling me to Google this stuff? But what is going to happen is you're going to start to see answers that come up again and again and again. You're going to want to make sure that whomever is giving that advice has some sort of credential. They're a certified financial planner, they're an accountant, they have some sort of credential behind their name that they are offering this advice. And then, listen to a handful of podcasts, maybe read a book or two. And if you are still struggling to make meaning of the information that you are seeking, then it may be time to reach out and get a little bit of help. A lot of people don't know this, but local credit unions provide a ton of free education. Sometimes they provide them seminar style. Right now, we're recording this during tax season. So I'm a member of a credit union, so I'll get these email blasts of like how to prepare for taxes in XYZ year, or did you know you can file your taxes with help at XYZ libraries on these particular dates. So turning to your credit union can be a great option for education, both seminar style, and sometimes they will offer one-on-one depending on the type of credit union that you're looking for. Another thing that a lot of people don't know is a resource called 211. 211 is a phone number that you can dial, or you can Google 211 plus your county name, and it will pull a list of community-based resources in your area that offer different information. In my area, I know that there are some universities that will put on seminars on first-time home buyers, or will help you understand what's on your credit report or your credit score. There are certain resources available to help you decide how to pay off your student loans, or if you're in a lot of financial trouble, whether or not something like bankruptcy might make sense. So you can get some really high quality personalized financial advice for free, or at least at a low cost, by seeking out resources within your community. And there's no shame in asking for that help. Now, of course, if you want to go on and pay for advice, that is also something that you can do. I'm a fan when it comes to the world of financial planning to seek a fee only financial planner where they say, this is my fee, and in exchange for my fee, you will get this particular service, versus somebody who does something called assets under management, often abbreviated as AUM, where they say, this is the amount of money you have. I'm going to take 1.5% of however much money you have, and I will give you advice. I mean, there are good AUM advisors out there, but for me personally, I'm going to be a fan of the fee only advisor route. And given that most of us are probably in the same age bracket, maybe give or take a handful of years, I think the XY Planning Network is a great directory. It helps people in those generations, so Gen X and Gen Y, which is us millennials, and now they're starting to get some younger Gen Z folks as well. But the XY Planning Network is a directory of fee-only financial planners in the US. So those are a few resources I would turn to. So first try and DIY it, then reach out for some local community-based resources. And if you really have a specific tax question or financial planning question, I would hire somebody to help you out with that.
Lindsay, that was so helpful.
Yay! I'm so glad.
Oh my goodness. And anything that has links, I'll make sure I link to
Yes,
those
of
below
course.
as well. But that was super helpful. I mean,
Cool.
I feel better. And I didn't even have some questions about some of the things that people were asking me about. Lindsay, you got some really good questions from your audience that all over the map, different specific questions. So I wonder again if there's any, maybe one or two that stands out to you that you feel like you can speak to.
So I'm scanning the list. So some questions questions that my audience asked were about kind of this stuckness of, I want to do this, but I'm in this place. So for example, I have this financial goal, but I really struggle asking my clients to pay me a certain fee, or I have a lot of comparison when I look at myself compared to others. So a little bit of this finding the balance, which I think is probably appropriate given the name of my business. So what I invite everybody to do when they're struggling with competing demands of how much should I save versus how much should I spend, or competing demands of I want to save up for a house, but I also want to go on vacation, is to check in with your personal values. What actually matters to you? And then making your financial decisions based on what matters the most to you right now. What I often like to think about is having a little bit of what can I do now and what can I do for my future self. So I'll often ask myself, like, is 47-year-old Lindsay going to be happy that 36-year-old Lindsay made this decision, right? So sometimes I'm thinking ahead to help me prioritize my financial needs and my financial goals. I think some general advice to keep in mind when it comes to having a healthy relationship with money and dealing with those competing demands is to first have a little financial cushion. This is sometimes known as an emergency fund or a rainy day fund. We want enough money sitting in a savings account to be able to help you in the event of an emergency. And an emergency could be something like experiencing a car accident or experiencing job loss. You want to have enough money there so that you can feed yourself and pay your bills and make sure that you're not getting into financial hardship if an emergency happens to you. At the time of this recording, the average cost of an emergency is about $1,400 in the US. So I always recommend having at least $1,400 in an account and then slowly dialing up that emergency fund or rainy day fund as time goes on. And then you also want to be thinking about kind of midterm goals and long-term goals. So a mid or short-term goal would be that vacation that you want to take, saving up a little bit of money every single month so you can take that vacation. And then long-term, I don't know about you, Marie, I love my work, but I also don't want to work forever. So I'm also thinking about the future. How can I invest and save more in retirement? So when it comes to feeling kind of constricted, so-and-so is doing this, should I be doing that? Should I be charging this much? Should I be saving this much? The answer is like, really keep your eyes on your own paper. What matters to you? If having a very large emergency fund feels really safe to you, then that's what you should do. If being really aggressive about retirement and saving as much money as you can feels safe for you, then go for it. But rather than comparing yourself to a random TikToker or even Marie or myself, do what is best for you.
I love that. That reminds me so much of acceptance and commitment therapy, of just kind of identifying your values, which is one of my favorite approaches for therapy in general. There's no blanket statement of like everyone should do this one thing. It's okay, how do you identify what matters to you? And then can we kind of identify some behaviors that align with that and incorporate them in? I think that's so valuable.
Marie, why don't you tell everyone, especially my therapist friends who are here, a little bit more about where they can follow you and find you and what you're up to?
Yeah, thanks. I have private practice skills as like the thing that I do on the internet, and I'm primarily on YouTube with that. And with private practice skills, I teach therapists about how to start and grow their private practice. And I also touch on kind of different things around kind of the culture of being a therapist, starting a second business, because that's what I did with private practice skills. And so you can definitely find me on YouTube. I have a free guide for how to start a private practice. If you're getting hung up on that, if that's where you're at in life and you're not sure where to start, I just kind of go through it. Start here and here and here and here, and I walk you through it.
Thank you again for putting on your data hat. I know it probably took you back to grad school to compile all of this data and put it together, but I think it's so helpful and validating for everyone to know that they aren't alone. That's what really struck me when you sent over this data from our audiences, was just how many of those questions were so similar to one another. And so many of us are wondering, am I doing this thing right? And so I really appreciate you taking the time to compile everything and for being here today and helping me get through all this data.
Oh my goodness. Likewise. I mean, I was having fun nerding out with all this, and I think it's going to help a lot of folks.
Thank you again to Marie of Private Practice Skills for having this interview with me and allowing me to do something a little bit different here on my channel. Everything that Marie shared will be linked down in the comments below, and you can find our corresponding video there as well. If after watching this video, you're like, oh my gosh, Lindsay, I have a question for you, please head to mindmoneybalance.com/ask. That's mindmoneybalance.com/ask, where you can submit your question for me that I might answer on an upcoming Ask Mind Money Balance episode. In the upcoming videos, I'm going to be talking to you about money and trauma, ADHD and money, and whether or not financial procrastination is real. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on those more psychologically minded episodes.